exclusive to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today, and I guess we'll start this program by saying welcome to the new reality. Those of us that have been around for a little time oftentimes say, when's the last time anybody ever paid attention to a special election? Of course, we spent a fair amount of time talking about that yesterday. Here's another one. When's the last time a vote by the FCC was a national discussion and debate? You know, those of us in broadcasting maybe pay attention, but the rest, really? Well, as you may know, this was a vote taken today by the FCC, and it was a decision to repeal the net neutrality rules that were implemented 2 years ago under the Obama administration. And so we'll talk just briefly about that. It is a complex issue, and I don't want to overdo it, but it is amazing how that has become such a controversial issue, and just illustrate again kind of this new reality that we find ourselves in. Teva Smiley found out that the PBS was going to actually suspend him, and he's decided to fight back and said, wait a minute, I have not done any of the things that have been alleged that I've done, and this has gone too far. So we'll see where that takes us in the next couple of weeks as well. If we have time in this first half hour, I also wanted to talk about the new survey that shows that a majority of Americans are convinced that the tax reform bill will raise their taxes, when the evidence is just the contrary. And as Guy Benson says, propaganda works. A majority of Americans now believe that the Republican bill will raise their taxes. They're wrong. We'll talk about that and maybe a few other issues. But later this hour, we'll have Robby Gallaty with us as we talk about maybe some things that relate to your Christian life in the midst of all of the news and information. I'd like to talk about how we as Christians can grow, and has a new book called Bearing Fruit. Second hour, Stephen Mansfield will be with us. His new book, Choosing Donald Trump, will be something we'll talk about as well. And I might just mention one of the articles we've posted, talk about how evangelicals are the ones that really pushed President Trump to declare Jerusalem as a capital, and we'll get back to that when we talk with Stephen Mansfield as well. But let's get to this issue of net neutrality. I won't spend long on it, because when you start talking about net neutrality rules, I think a lot of our eyes tend to glaze over. But the chairman of the FCC, Anjit Pai, has been on the program with us before, actually wants to have what he calls a light touch regulatory approach to the Internet. His argument is from 1996, when they started talking about whether to have any kind of rules for the Internet under the Clinton administration, they decided not to. So from 1996 to 2015, the Internet pretty much operated quite well. But then we were told that we needed to have these rules, these net neutrality rules. I'll tell you in just a minute where they come from, which I think will start getting you a little more concerned. And so for the last 2 years, we've had those rules. And again, those of you that are older, I want to ask, in those previous 19 years, was there a problem that required us to have those rules? And now what's happened in the last 2 years? And one of the things that Anjit Pai, who is the FCC chairman, said is it's time for the Internet once again to be driven by engineers and entrepreneurs and consumers rather than lawyers, accountants, and bureaucrats. And he argues that actually the rules that were adopted during the Obama administration discourage Internet service providers from making investments in their network to provide better and faster online services. That is really not up for debate. If you look at the numbers, and I have, and you can look them up as well as anybody else, you can see that there was an enormous amount of investment in the Internet. And then when 2015 came, a lot of the internet service providers said, uh-oh, is this, what's happening next? Now that the government's kind of controlling this, just as people in sort of the healthcare industry didn't know what the Affordable Care Act was going to do, so some of those people with ISPs and broadband and things like that didn't know what these rules were going to be. And so investment has actually been curtailed under that. So if nothing else, net neutrality is the kind of the idea that ISPs, those would be internet service providers, must treat all legal internet data the same, regardless of where it comes from or who it goes to. And, of course, the critics have said all sorts of things. Repealing net neutrality, they say, would mean that consumers would start paying more for internet services. We'll see, but, that it will remain to be seen. So far, we've had this vote, and the internet hasn't broken yet, so I think we're good. I think we're good at the moment, at least. Consumers also would see the ISPs start to maybe bundle services, such as certain websites and applications, maybe charge more depending on what a person wants access to. But again, in a free market, if one ISP is expensive, couldn't there be another one that would provide an alternative? Now, again, in some places where you only have one choice, I understand that as well. But I love what Julian Sanchez says. He says there's plenty of scaremongering around steps broadband providers could take in the absence of neutrality regulation, blocking off certain sites, charging extra fees to access certain services, but not a ton of reason to think that they would do these things, which would antagonize customers, be technically tricky to enforce against sophisticated users, and invite the reimposition of regulations. Because that's the point I will make. I'm not going to try to argue one way or the other. This is a complex issue. But if we did pretty well 19 years, and now we have these regulations for the last 2 years, if indeed we really are convinced that we made a big mistake today, then we could re-implement them. Now, the reality is I know there's going to be a court case, so that's the end of that. I mean, they will stick around for a while simply because it'll have to be litigated in the courts. And frankly, it would be good if Congress were to really address this issue. These rules were implemented 2 years ago. I think it was a 3-2 vote then, and there was no transparency. I remember at the time writing commentary saying we did not even know what the rules are. Let me give Commissioner Pai at least credit for the fact that from Thanksgiving on, everybody saw what he was going to do, so there at least was transparency. But again, it was a 3-2 vote. Maybe we need to implement something that's going to affect something as large as the internet with something more than a 3-2 vote either way by some commissioners that have been appointed to the FCC. So that's one of those issues. But if you kind of wonder where this comes from, before we take a break, let me just mention that the chairman of the FCC back then was an individual that went to Harvard Law School with Barack Obama, and he was arguing that this would actually incentivize competition and grow the economic pie. Not what has happened so far the last 2 years. And the original idea for net neutrality comes from what's called the Communist Manifesto. It's kind of a play on words like .com. It's called the Communist Manifesto. And you can go read the Communist Manifesto because it actually talks about the fact that they want to use these kind of rules to wrest from the bourgeoisie the patrimony of humankind that is stolen intellectual property. They also talk about limiting free speech on the internet, talking about removing private ownership and transferring control to the government. So if you wanted to know where some of those rules for net neutrality come from, the original ideas were found in the .com Manifesto, and they were implemented by an individual that went to law school with Barack Obama. If you know just that alone, maybe you can see why maybe there wasn't such a draconian action taken today by actually removing some of those net neutrality rules. And all the claims that this would prevent, for example, as I heard one individual say, women from even knowing where they could get an abortion, or this is going to be something that is going to make it harder for Black Lives Matter. No, I don't think so. But that's the vote today. Just thought I'd mention it. And if you read a little bit more about it, let us know what you think. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, the carol, O Come, Emmanuel, is an English translation of a Latin hymn that was sung during Advent and Christmas. The text goes back to at least the 18th century and perhaps much earlier, while the music goes back to the 15th century. O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel, that mourns in lonely exile here until the Son of God appear. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to thee, O Israel. Emmanuel means God with us. Even before the coming of Christ, we see passages in the Old Testament that remind us that God was with Israel. In 1 Kings 8, we read, Praise the Lord, who has given rest to his people Israel, just as he promised. Not one word has failed of all the wonderful promises he gave through his servant Moses. May the Lord our God be with us as he was with our ancestors. May he never leave us or abandon us. In Psalm 46, we read that the Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our stronghold. One of the most visible reminders of God's presence was during the Exodus. God was with the Israelites as a pillar of fire by night and a pillar of smoke by day. His presence was with them in the tabernacle and later in the temple in the Holy of Holies. But the most important aspect of Emmanuel is found in the New Testament. John tells us in his gospel, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. This is the miracle of the incarnation. God put on human flesh and came to Israel so that he might give his life for all of us. Paul writes to Timothy, Here is the great mystery of our religion. Christ came as a human. This is what we celebrate at Christmas. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join a conversation, 1-800-351-1212. This is one of those programs where last night I thought it was going to go one direction, and this morning it changed rather dramatically. I thought, well, we do probably need to talk a little bit about net neutrality. But the other issue I want to put on the table before we get back to the tax reform bill is this. Tavis Smiley was suspended indefinitely by PBS because of certain kinds of accusations of sexual misconduct. Now, when I first heard about that, I thought, well, we'll see where this one goes. And it didn't take long because he has decided, and I think this is going to be one of those issues now that we will have to start talking about as to whether or not these accusations should be enough to suspend a person from their particular duties. Because he has blasted PBS for its decision to indefinitely suspend him following some of the accusations of sexual misconduct. He said things like, I've never groped, coerced, or exposed myself to any workplace colleague in 6 different networks. He is very clear to say, this is what I have not done. I have the utmost respect for women and celebrate the courage of those who have come forward to tell the truth. He goes on to say, you know, during his entire broadcast career, which is 6 networks over 30 years, he says, this has gone too far, and I, for one, intend to fight back. Now, this is, of course, one of the concerns we raised. I am applauding, and I think all of us are applauding the women, and in some cases the men that have come out and expressed their concern about superior who has taken advantage of him or her, who has made comments, who has done things that are inappropriate.
But at the same time, if you've been listening to this program any length of time, we recognize that sometimes these allegations are false. Whether it's the Duke lacrosse case, or maybe in this case it becomes Tavis Smiley. Let me read a little bit more. He said he was shocked to find out about his suspension. And really, interestingly enough, it was Variety that first reported the story. They knew about this before he did. He said that the public broadcasting service began its investigation without informing him, and he only realized what was happening after some of former staff members started contacting him, and they were asked to share if there was any uncomfortable experience that they had had with him, or if he had ever done anything to make them uncomfortable, or if they could provide other names of persons to call. So obviously there are some women, I gather, at the beginning that made some kind of claim, but then he said that PBS did eventually interview him, but did not take into account what he says his personal documentation, and also he says they refused to provide me any semblance of due process to defend myself against allegations from unknown sources. He says their mind was made up. Well, in this statement that has come out today, PBS said it stood by its decision. Following a receipt of a complaint, they said, PBS hired an independent law firm to conduct an investigation. We stand by its integrity. The totality of the investigation, which included Mr. Smiley, revealed a pattern of multiple relationships with subordinates over many years and other conduct inconsistent with the values and standards of PBS. You've heard us say this before. How do you disprove, allegations? Prove a negative. Now, he does maintain, this doesn't help him, that he did have a consensual relationship with a colleague years ago. But but he says even there, what was described in Variety was not true. And Variety reported that PBS investigation found Smiley engaged in sexual relationship with subordinates after 10 reports from witnesses, men and women of varying employment levels. Most were former staff members. And so, again, Smiley said, it's time for a real conversation in America so men and women know how to engage in the workplace. I look forward to actively participating in that conversation. So the reason I bring that up, he's just one of many people on that list, but he perhaps so far is the one that has challenged it the most. Just because he challenges it doesn't mean he's not guilty. But just because the allegations there doesn't mean he's guilty either. So the bottom line is that we may have to pay attention to this. And as we have talked about on this program more than once, sometimes people are tried in the court of public opinion long before they're tried in the courts. And this particular one is intriguing because he is so adamant and so willing to fight this, that and especially since it's a high-profile individual. Oh, by the way, might I mention, because he's African-American, isn't that interesting, too, how that played itself out with PBS? So I'll leave that on the table for someone to talk about as well. And also, there are very different, very contradictory kind of reports coming from PBS, Variety, and Tavis Smiley. And so at this point, we will see where that one takes us in the future. Just before we take a break and then come back and spend some time talking about how to grow as a Christian with Robby Gallaty, I thought I would pick up one other piece, and that is we are going to have a vote, no doubt, next week before Christmas, and that will be a vote both in the House and in the Senate. The vote in the Senate will be interesting because we recognize we've elected a new senator from Alabama, but he won't be seated yet, so Luther Strange will still vote there. But will we have John McCain there? He's in the hospital at the moment. Will we have a couple of other members of the United States Senate? It will be interesting to see if they can come up with the 51 votes. But in the midst of that, as Guy Benson in his piece today talks about, propaganda works. A majority of Americans now believe the Republican bill will raise their taxes. They're wrong. And he points out a national survey that shows that 52%, that is a majority, of U.S. voters believe the Republican tax reform proposal will negatively impact their personal financial situation. Less than 1 in 3 respondents think they will benefit. This overwhelmingly inaccurate perception, he says, represents the fruit of the media-aided labor over the last couple of weeks, as we've seen it's been flooding the debate with false, factually false allegations and ludicrous hysteria. The truth, as we've relayed on numerous occasions, is that the nonpartisan analysis of the plan have collected on the average every income
group will receive a tax cut, including, if not especially, the middle class. He says, I've not shied away from conceding potential negative outcomes for certain taxpayers, nor have I dismissed deficit-related concerns. The fact remains, however, that the exceedingly lopsided majority of taxpayers will see their tax burdens lowered and, interesting enough, after-tax incomes rise under the Republican bill. Now, you can agree or disagree with whether we should pass tax reform, but at least I hope wherever you are on this, you've got to be upset about the fact that we have a good example of what oftentimes people call fake news, or at least fake perceptions. Let's understand this for just a minute. Roughly 70% of the people that will file taxes in April under the old plan would already take what is called a standard deduction. Now, under this new plan, under this tax reform plan, if you've heard me say it once, you've heard me say it dozens of times, the standard deduction now will double. That means there are probably a higher percentage of individuals that will be taking a standard deduction and not even itemize. So when individuals that are in the media say, well, there are a lot of people who will not see any difference in their tax bill, that's because they're taking the standard deduction. And it won't make any difference because they, in many cases, took the standard deduction before. They take the standard deduction now. But because the deduction is higher, they will, first of all, get more of their money back or not have to pay as much in because their deduction is twice what it is. So if you just start with those numbers alone, then you really have to say, where can you even find places where people actually will see their taxes go up? And he says only a small sliver of taxpayers, in the ballpark of maybe 10%, might expect to see their tax bill rise due to tax reform, and those are disproportionately wealthier itemizers who live in high-tax blue states. Okay, if you make $250,000 and you live in New York, Illinois, California, you know what? Your taxes might indeed go up because you're going to not benefit from some of the deductions that used to exist in your state, in particular because you pay a state income tax. But that is certainly not the case for the vast majority of Americans. Anyway, again, you can read the piece. You can go out and check out all sorts of different analysis that have been done, but it's just a good example of the need to read widely and to really begin to not believe everything you see in a headline, because, as he points out, a majority of Americans are convinced their tax bill will go up. And if indeed tax reform passes and it's implemented, some of them are going to be surprised. They're going to actually have more money coming back on their tax refund, or they'll have to pay less in taxes in the first case. Let's take a break, though. We got a lot more to cover. And Robby Gallaty will be with us. We're going to talk about his new book. It's part of a series, Bearing Fruit, What Happens When God's People Grow. I want to do something that will help you grow in your Christian faith, and I think you'll appreciate not only his testimony, but some really great insights in his book. So we'll come back and talk with him right after this.
Today, you can make a difference, but you have to act. Recently, Kerby sat down with a couple in California, Stan and Jennifer. Jennifer said, like many Christians, they were concerned about the direction of the culture, but simply hoped something would change. On one of her regular walks through the neighborhood, listening to the radio, she happened across Point of View, and before long, she was convinced wishing things would change was not enough. She began taking what she was learning and applying it and sharing it. She even went to the state capitol in Sacramento to stand up for what she believes. You would be surprised how much difference one Jennifer can make, and how many Jennifers you can inspire by giving to Point of View. Your gift today will shape hearts and minds across the nation, helping to shape our future. And thanks to a surprise donor challenge, your gift will be doubled up to at least $45,000. Give today at pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. Answer the challenge. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Next half hour, I want to spend some time asking the question, why is it so many Christians are stagnant in their faith? How can Christians grow? The technical word for that is sanctification, because after you become a Christian, you are to grow in your faith and even to bear fruit. And so we're going to spend some time working through one of the books in a series. The first book, called Growing Up, based on Psalm 1, verses 1 and 2. Firmly Planted, verse 3 in Psalm 1, and then now Bearing Fruit. And so this is part of a series of books that I think you're going to really benefit from. And the author of each one of those is Pastor Robby Gallaty. He is the pastor at Long Hollows, and he has been the senior pastor there since 2015. I want to talk a little bit about his testimony. It's an incredible testimony of heroin and cocaine addiction. But later, of course, spent some time with David Platt, who we've had on the program with us as well, and really had a chance to really spend time in accountability prayer and Bible study, really grew in his passion for the ministry, completed a Master's of Divinity degree as well as a PhD in preaching from New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary. And Robby Gallaty, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
I might just mention we are talking about the third book in the series, but give us an overview of the other two, because as we get into this, each one of them are based upon different verses in Psalm 1.
Yeah, you know, as you said, and maybe I'll give you a snippet of my testimony in a moment, but I've realized that just growing in the Christian faith and being a disciple who makes disciples is something we know as Christians we should do, but we don't really know how to do that. Like Christians, and those listening would agree, we know we need to be disciples who make disciples, right? But many people don't know how to do that. And here's what I found in the church. When you don't know what to do, Kerby, you don't do anything at all.
That's right.
And so I really believe that people wanted a practical, reproducible process for not only being a disciple, but making disciples. So the three-book series is simply Growing Up is the book we use in all of our disciple-making groups. And, you know, the best time to strike and to start a group is in January, and so we're gearing up here at Long Hollow to reproduce groups of people who have been in groups. And so men meet with men, women meet with women. The groups tend to be the size of about 3 to 5, and the reason I found that small environment, it really works well for accountability and intimacy and transparency. But the book Growing Up is what we use, and that's what all the groups grow through for about 10 weeks. It's basically a guide to walking with God. I came up with this acronym called CLOSER. how to communicate with God, how to learn through the Scriptures, how to obey the commands of Christ, how to store Scripture in one's mind, how to evangelize or share one's faith, and then finally, how to renew one's really walk with God through journaling. The second book, Firmly Planted, based on Psalm 1, is how we as Christians can grow in our faith. And basically, I wanted to call it Theology for Dummies, but that one was taken already, right? So I wanted to just basically take this top-shelf theology and bring it down for everybody to understand. So we talk about some really important doctrines like who you are in Christ, your identity, how you can be assured of your salvation. How do I know I'm saved? How to walk with Christ, how to walk in the Spirit biblically, how to engage in spiritual warfare. Paul talks a lot about that. How to pray in the midst of a battle, how to overcome sin. And then finally, this book, Bearing Fruit, is the last book of the three-part series. And what this is, and this is interesting, I did kind of a cursory study on the word fruit in the New Testament. Do you know the word fruit is used 7 times in the New Testament? It's used in different contexts, and it's always the result of a life abiding in Christ. So the case I make in the book is we don't actually manufacture fruit ourselves. We can't do that, right? God does that. But we can align ourselves in an environment where God will bear much fruit in our life. And the result of that is you'll have the fruit of repentance, or the fruit of service, or the fruit of sanctification, the fruit of righteousness. Some know the fruit of the Spirit, right, or the fruit of praise. And what I do throughout the book is I unpack what fruit-bearing looks like in a mature follower of Christ.
Fascinating. Also, I might just mention there is the Disciples Study Bible, which is part of the Christian Standard Bible. We'll get to that in just a minute. We have a link to longhollow.com, so if you want to know a little bit more about Robby, and especially these books are going to be great resources for you to consider what you might want to do if you're a Sunday school teacher, small group leader, and you're thinking about what to do come 2018. That's why we wanted to cover some of that today. You did allude to your background. It's an incredible story, and we could spend an hour just getting your testimony out, but share that, because in some respects, your background, your testimony, the remarkable change in your life is one of the reasons why you are so dedicated to discipleship, isn't it?
That's exactly right. I actually am the product of disciple making. And I know people listening would say, you know, I didn't have the privilege of being intentionally discipled, or I wish I would have. Obviously, we can't change the past, but we can change how we move from here. And I just grew up in a very religious home. I was Catholic, Roman Catholic, half Italian. We were very religious, went to church every Sunday. If we missed church on Sunday, confession on Saturday. I knew who Jesus was, but I didn't have a relationship with him. I didn't walk and talk and hear from God. And so I got a scholarship to play basketball, unbeknownst to me at the time, at a Southern Baptist college. And when I got on the campus, Kerby, I was the target of every evangelism class on campus, right? Who do we tell about Jesus? We tell Robby. And, man, I heard the gospel, and I would reject the gospel. Got out in 1998. I was in a computer business, network marketing kind of a business, and it went belly up, and I thought, you know what, I don't want to do anything in the world as far as business goes. And so I started to train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Now, Kerby, I don't know if you've ever seen the UFC or this type of no-hold-bars fighting, but yes. I'm 6'6", 290 pounds back then. And I'm out at a club one night, a bar, a restaurant, and a guy comes up to me and he says, hey, would you be interested in being the head bouncer of my club downtown New Orleans in the middle of Mardi Gras? I said, Gino, let me get this straight. You're going to pay me to fight? I'm in, right? So I thought, you know, there's a great business opportunity for me at the time. So I went into this bouncing world, and for the next 3 months, it was the wildest time of my life. I realized I needed a career change when I was escorting 2 guys to the parking lot. They said things I can't repeat now. One of them leaned under a seat, pulled out a loaded 9mm, pointed it toward me, and said, now tell me what to do. And I thought, okay, I need a career change. Made a lateral move from bouncing to bartending. You know, I went from outside the club to inside the club.
Yes.
I'm driving home from work, November 22nd, 1999. This is where my whole life changed. An 18-wheeler comes across 2 lanes of traffic, sandwiches my car in the guardrail, 65 miles an hour. My seatbelt locks, my back torques. I herniate 2 discs in my neck, 2 discs in my back. 22 years old, I go to the doctor. I've never taken drugs in my life before, but I'm legitimately in pain. And they send me home with 4 things: OxyContin, Valium, Soma, and Percocet. And here I am, and you know the story. Here I am within 3 months addicted to pharmaceutical drugs.
Yes.
I don't have a desire to make money, don't have a desire to be successful. Times were good in the beginning. I actually, by the world standards, had tons of money. I would run through the drugs that were supposed to last me 30 days and 2 weeks. A friend of mine, so-called friend in the city, says, hey, why are you fooling with pharmaceutical drugs? You can buy street drugs. You can buy heroin and cocaine. You can buy it in bulk. You can bag it, sell it, make money, fuel your habit. I took the business knowledge from the world, brought it into the drug world. And for the next 3 years, I started this illegal import business where I was trafficking drugs from Mexico to Miami, ecstasy, GHB, Special K, heroin, cocaine. And I'm not telling the listeners this to impress them, but I want to impress upon them just really how far the Lord brought me from.
I know.
Times were good.
Amazing.
Tons of money. But you know how the story ends. I ran out of money. My addiction was overwhelming. I robbed my own family for $15,000. I memorized my parents' credit card number when they weren't looking and charged $15,000 on the family bank account. I never forget the day, Kerby, that Mom called. She said, we found out about what you did, and your father's disappointed, and I'm furious with you. Don't you ever come to this house again. And it was that tough love for the next 3 months. And just a side note to those listening, because we all have been affected by the ravages of drugs and alcohol. We all know a family member or a friend or son or daughter or parent. You know, it was the tough love from my mom and dad that saved my life.
That is.
Since that time, 14 friends died. 6 have been to prison.
Yes.
And I tell people this because whenever you see a perpetual drug problem, as you know, it's always the result of an enabler. Right? Someone in the enabler thinks they're doing a good thing, and it's hard to do tough love. That's why it's called tough love.
Yeah. Well, when you take a break, but if nothing else, again, I have a link to longhollow.com. People can read some more about that. And just an incredible story. Need to take a break. We'll continue our conversation with Robby Gallaty right after these important messages.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Most residents of Lehigh County, Pennsylvania probably have no idea what their county seal looks like. It has a cow, factories, a silo, an oil lamp set on 2 books, a courthouse, flags and bunting, and more. Recently, a federal district court reluctantly declared the seal unconstitutional because, centered in the background of it all, is a cross. According to the court's opinion, quote, the county has not legally compelled its citizens to practice and conform to Christianity, infringed on freedom of conscience, or created political conflict between the Christian church and other religious sects. Simply put, the county of Lehigh did not intend to establish religion or institute a county religion, unquote. And so the court concluded, quote, Lehigh County's seal is a passive symbol that does not coerce any citizen to practice or adhere to Christianity and does not establish a county religion. Thus, the seal does not violate the plain text of the Establishment Clause, nor does it establish a religion in the way the drafters of the First Amendment imagined. Higher courts, however, have delineated a different mechanism by which the court must determine whether the seal survives constitutional scrutiny. While the court may not fully agree with the test provided, the court must apply that test, unquote. Well, we can only hope an appeal will change that test. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Students and teachers are being told that prayer, Bibles, and religion are illegal in public school, but that's not true. Learn the facts. Read your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org right now. Don't let anyone steal your freedom with bad information. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And for a few more minutes with Robby Gallaty, and let me again just encourage you to consider whether or not this might be a series you would like to take your own small group through, your church through, your Bible study. The first book, of course, Growing Up, based on Psalm 1, verses 1 and 2. Then book 2, Firmly Planted, which is verse 3. And then this one, we're talking about bearing fruit, and it talks about how fruit grows, the fruit of repentance, the fruit of ministry, the fruit of sanctification, the fruit of righteousness, the fruit of good works, the fruit of the Spirit, and the fruit of praise. These are great resources to really help people grow. And this is really one of the questions as to why so many Christians are stagnant in their faith. If you'd like to know a little bit more about Robby Gallaty, of course, we have a link to the Long Hollow Baptist Church website, and you can learn a little bit more about his testimony. Of course, you can type his name and see some great videos in which he shares the entire testimony, which is just powerful. But Robby, give us a little bit of a sense on how to do this. We have pastors, we have Sunday school leaders, Bible fellowship leaders, small group leaders listening to this. How can they use the book? And then also, let's, if we can, in just a minute, talk about this Disciples Study Bible, because that's another resource that I think churches would like to use as well.
Yeah, I will say, just kind of transitioning into the resources. So I was the product of discipleship. After I got saved, David Platt met with me for 2 years. And some may know him from the book Radical he wrote. And
sure.
He's the president of the International Mission Board. And what we did is we simply got into the Word. And what I like to share, and there's a lot of great resources out there. I've written some resources, but really the Bible is the textbook. Right? I mean, we have to get into the Word until the Word gets into us.
Yes.
And that's why we were so excited to partner with Lifeway to produce the Disciples Study Bible. And basically, we wanted to create a resource that would allow people to get in the Word, to journal through the Word, to memorize Scripture in the Word, and to meet in a small context with a bunch of other people. So what we promote is a system whereby you'll meet for 12 to 18 months. And keep in mind, Jesus had this. Remember, he had the large group of the 120 or the 70 disciples. He actually had a 12-person group, a community group of the 12. But he actually had a D group, a discipleship group of 3 guys and himself. Remember, Peter, James, and John.
Right.
And so we're just kind of modeling the ministry of Jesus. So what we encourage people to do is meet for 12 to 18 months. And these are people you know, people you go to life group with, people you're in Sunday school with, 12 to 18 months. Get in the Word every day, and then supplement the time with resources. That's the reason I wrote the book series, just so you can supplement those times throughout the year. What we've done in the Disciples Bible is my wife Candy and I have created a Bible reading plan where you can read the Bible in a year. You won't read every passage, but you'll get a picture of the whole meta-narrative of Scripture. Because here's the reality, and if those listening are honest, they'll say the same thing. We all start great in January with Genesis, right?
Oh, yes.
We cruise through Exodus in February, and by the time we hit March with Leviticus, the wheels fall off, right? And here's what happens. We're checking boxes, if you're like me. Leviticus 15, check. Leviticus 16, check. And we feel, in a sense, like we're in the wilderness. Like, how much longer, Lord? What happens is our Bible reading time moves from hearing from God to just checking boxes.
Right.
What happens is we cannot read 5 to 6 chapters a day, 7 days a week, no days off. If you go on vacation, what happens is you throw out those 5 and 6 chapters, and you can't catch up. Poor Ezekiel, he's gone. There's no way you're reading 32 chapters. So my wife and I created a Bible reading plan, get this, where you read 1 to 2 chapters a day.
Right.
You read 5 days a week, not 7. You're going to read less to digest more. And we have embedded that plan in this Bible. And here's the great thing. We have a journaling method that I've used for the past decade that truly has changed people's lives because you're hearing from God. It's called HEAR, highlight, explain, apply, respond. And Kerby, the pages to journal are adjacent to the day's reading in the Bible. So what's so cool about it is it's a keepsake. So for the rest of my life, as I go through 2018, I can't wait, I will be able to journal what God is doing in my life at that time through that year and give it to my children to show what God was doing in Dad's life for years to come.
And again, I might just mention in those introductory sections there, you have the sample here entry for highlight, explain, apply, and respond. You have a sample prayer log, and then you have the Bible reading plan. And like you said, as you go through that, I'll just turn to one there, Genesis 31 and 32, you have the HEAR, and you have an opportunity, there would be in week 4, to actually summarize what you've studied. Then you have the memory verses. This is the most complete Bible I've seen, and this is just ideal for a disciple. So again, you have the Bearing Fruit book that we've talked about, which is part of the whole series of books, Growing Up, Firmly Planted, and Bearing Fruit, and the Disciples Study Bible. But if people wanted to contact you, Robby, maybe they're saying, okay, I need a little more direction before I implement this in my church or my small group. Is it possible they could contact you there at Long Hollow?
Absolutely. We actually have a ministry because of the need. A lot of people will hear me talk about my passion for disciple making, and people will realize, okay, Jesus told us to do this. He didn't tell us to go out and plant churches. He didn't tell us to go out and revitalize churches. He didn't tell us to go out and make decisions or even make converts or even make Christians. He told us, Matthew 28, 18 through 20, go make disciples. Now, it's easier said than done, and so out of this, just this need we saw in the local church, we created a ministry, my wife and I, in 2008 called Replicate. This is the ministry that partnered with Lifeway to produce this Disciples Bible, and so people can go to replicate.org, and we do trainings. We actually host trainings here in Nashville, in the Nashville area at our church. And we do trainings periodically throughout the year. And basically what we do is we just kind of walk people through this pathway that we've come up with, which we believe will work in every church context and any church background because it's a biblical model. We don't have a monopoly on making disciples. Jesus did that, right? So we're just taking his model and just sharing how people can implement this, not only in their church, but even in their own personal lives.
So again, Replicate, and of course we have a link to Long Hollow Baptist Church. Again, you can find a lot of these resources in your local bookstore. These are published by B&H, and you have the whole series that I've mentioned before, Growing Up, Firmly Planted, Bearing Fruit, and then be looking for the Disciples Study Bible. This is a way in which you can begin to journal through the year, and we wanted to cover some of this now so that first of all, you could make this as a real quick gift for Christmas, but also it's just a great way to get started January 1st to work your way through the year and actually read through the Bible in a year and have a little bit of grace in the midst of this, and at the same time have an opportunity to make it real and to really help you grow and then help you use that so you can help others grow as well. So, Robby, I appreciate the incredible focus that you have in your ministry in that regard. Thank you so much for your incredible testimony, and thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's been a joy to be with you.
Again, Robby Gallaty, you can find out a lot more by simply going to our website, or we also link to his website as well. You probably can find some of these resources in your local bookstore, so please take the time to go there and get this series of books. The latest one we've been talking about is Bearing Fruit. The earlier ones, Growing Up and Firmly Planted. And if you're looking for something to start your church out or your small group or your Bible fellowship, this is the great way to go. And this new Disciples Study Bible is one where you will use it not only to learn God's Word, but to journal and to memorize Scripture and to actually achieve what has been a goal, I think, for a lot of Christians for years, and that is to read through the Bible in 1 year. So again, lots of great resources. Wanted you to know about that, especially as we're thinking about what happens in January. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, Stephen Mansfield will be with us, Choosing Donald Trump. Oh, boy. We are going to cover a little bit more about the election of Donald Trump, maybe some lessons we can learn from the 2016 election as we get into the 2018 midterm elections as well. So a lot to cover, and we will do that right after these important messages.
Today, you can make a difference, but you have to act. Recently, Kerby sat down with a couple in California, Stan and Jennifer. Jennifer said, like many Christians, they were concerned about the direction of the culture, but simply hoped something would change. On one of her regular walks through the neighborhood, listening to the radio, she happened across Point of View, and before long, she was convinced wishing things would change was not enough. She began taking what she was learning and applying it and sharing it. She even went to the state capitol in Sacramento to stand up for what she believes. You would be surprised how much difference one Jennifer can make, and how many Jennifers you can inspire by giving to Point of View. Your gift today will shape hearts and minds across the nation, helping to shape our future. And thanks to a surprise donor challenge, your gift will be doubled up to at least $45,000. Give today at pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. Answer the challenge. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to take on the issue of Donald Trump. You know, if I had told you 2 years ago that he would be the Republican nominee, you probably wouldn't have believed it. If I told you that a number of prominent Christians were supporting him, you would certainly not believe it. And if I told you he became president, even more so, you would not believe it. And yet, of course, this is exactly where we are. So that's why we want to talk about this new book, Choosing Donald Trump, by Stephen Mansfield, and it is interesting to see the reaction to that. Glenn Beck says, I think this is a game-changing book. Eric Metaxas has been on in studio with us recently, said this is an important book. I wish everyone could have read this book 10 years ago, at least read it now. Brian Kilmeade, who's been on this week with us, as a matter of fact, Stephen Mansfield's latest book, takes on one of the most common points of contention in the news today, religion. He's demanding that candidates come clean in their beliefs before they get to the Oval Office. He's right, and he makes his case in a unique, fascinating manner that is rich in American history. Dave Ramsey said every voter in this country should read this book. So a lot of people talking about this book, so we thought you would certainly want to hear about that as well. Stephen Mansfield has been on the program with us many times before. He's the New York Times best-selling author of, for example, The Faith of George W. Bush, The Faith of Barack Obama. We've talked about some of the others, Lincoln's battle with God and the character and greatness of Winston Churchill. This new book, Choosing Donald Trump, and it is another book that is no doubt will be a New York Times bestseller. And Stephen, welcome back to Point of View.
Great to be back with you. Thank you.
Okay, let's try to make some sense out of that as you do in the book. Donald Trump is running against a Baptist pastor. Two of the candidates are sons of pastors. Most of, not all, but most of those running would be considered evangelicals, and he becomes the nominee. In some reasons, that's why you wrote the book, isn't it?
Exactly. It's a shock that he's president. He's a shock that he essentially beat those people in the primaries. And it's a shock, as you've said in your introduction, that religious leaders, prominent religious leaders, have rallied to him. So, yeah, we're standing in territory nobody expected.
Let's, if we can, maybe talk about how he saw a divide, something that the pollsters did not see, because you talk about God, anger, hope, why Christian conservatives supported him. And I love the way the chapters are broken down, because you have works like King, Killer, Peel, White. Each one of those will make sense as we go through those. But there was kind of a convergence of issues, and you talk about that in the first chapter.
Yes, there's no question. I mean, I think as we talk about Paula White, we'll learn a little bit more about how Donald Trump got tutored in religious liberty issues, and of course that's a lot of it. But his economic empowerment message, his anger, his rawness, the way that he saw that there had been voters who had been marginalized. I live in the South, so we humorously call it the Bubba vote. But white voters who were angry about their displacement, angry about their lack of economic empowerment. And Donald Trump came along and just in the primaries knocked everybody off balance and put his foot right in that fissure, right at a point in the American political line where he could peel off some voters and rally them to himself, and it worked.
Let's see if we can, since you mentioned Paula White, that's the 6th chapter. Let's jump ahead, because that was new to me. Certainly, I've had relationships and friendships with a lot of the people that you mentioned there, and Robert Jeffress has been in the studio many times, and a variety of other people that we can talk about. And, of course, everybody would know, certainly, Jerry Falwell Jr. and the rest, but I did not realize how key Paula White was in terms of not only educating Donald Trump about the religious groups, but also building a bridge to some of those religious groups. So fill in that blank, because that was really new information as I read through your book.
Well, Paula White really is responsible for much of Donald Trump's victory. There's just no question about it. She's an unusual figure. She is a televangelist. She's the pastor of a prominent church in Florida, has a very strong television presence, is very popular among African-American Christians. And she became known to Donald Trump when he was watching TV late one night, religious TV, and came across her broadcast and heard her teaching about vision. And her approach is very practical. You have to plan, you have to prepare, you have to train, etc. He loved what he heard. He'd heard some things like that before. He called her, told her he was impressed. They began to have a bit of a friendship. He invited her to come meet he and his wife. And Paula White blended right in the Trump company, became chaplain to a lot of the people there, became friends to the Trump family. And when Donald Trump decided to run for president, he asked her if she would craft and put together listening sessions with prominent clergy around the country, and where he could learn about the concerns of these clergy, maybe begin to mend his reputation a little bit in their minds, etc. Well, to Paula White's credit, even though she's from a charismatic Pentecostal background and has that style in her ministry, she reached very much across denominational lines. She brought in people very unlike her, brought in Orthodox leaders, brought in Catholic leaders, brought in Southern Baptist, Presbyterians, all across the spectrum, also invited rabbis, etc., and they sat with him, and people of every ethnicity and background. That's where he learned, for example, about the Johnson Amendment. That's where he learned about what it meant to pastor a church in the inner city. That's where he learned about these religious liberty issues that weigh so heavily on so many American Christians. So if the cynical will say he learned the language of the religious right, perhaps people looking a little bit more intently will say that he began to gain some compassion for the issues of these people. Regardless of your conclusion, he began to speak about religious liberty issues. He began to speak about the war on Christmas. He began to speak about the Johnson Amendment. And this resonated with religious Americans who, of course, coming out of the Obama years, had felt, traumatized on the issue of religion. Lawsuits against the Green family of Hobby Lobby, et cetera. This was a terrible time, and they feared more with Hillary Clinton. So Paula White put together the listening sessions and tutored Donald Trump in the language and the values, I think, to some extent, that have helped him win the presidency. There's just no question about it.
Well, and what's so interesting is you think about other people that run for the presidency, whether it was Pat Robertson or certainly Mike Huckabee, or go through the long list. They already knew, if you will, the language of the evangelical world. Donald Trump would probably be the least likely person to learn it, but if it weren't for Paula White and helping maybe him translate some of that, that's where there was a sense of momentum that carried him through, for example, the South Carolina primaries and some of those. True?
Exactly. And I think it was refreshing to many voters to hear these words coming out of his mouth. You expect them out of Dr. Jeffers or out of Pat Robertson. You expect to hear words about religious liberty or the Johnson Amendment or the war on Christmas, etc. You don't expect it coming from Donald Trump. So people were thrilled. Plus, when you add that to the Trump's drive and his history of success and the fact that people actually believed he could win, this became a toxic brew and won him many voters.
Well, we'll take a break, and when we come back, we're going to continue our conversation today with Stephen Mansfield. Again, just all sorts of great books he's written over the years, and we certainly have appreciated his Faith Of series that have really helped us understand, for example, the faith of George W. Bush and others. And this is a new book out that I think you're going to want to read because it takes you behind the scenes and maybe sort of answers the questions of how it was that some very prominent Christians came early on to support Donald Trump, and then after he won the nomination, others who maybe had all sorts of reasons to not like him nevertheless did so. And so we're going to get into that in a little more detail, but also want to open up the phones because I want to give you a chance to interact and ask some questions and make some comments. So all of it today, certainly available to you. 1-800-351-1212. We have information about the book, about Stephen Mansfield and his website at our website, pointofview.net. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, the carol, O Come, Emmanuel, is an English translation of a Latin hymn that was sung during Advent and Christmas. The text goes back to at least the 18th century and perhaps much earlier, while the music goes back to the 15th century. O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel, that mourns in lonely exile here until the Son of God appear. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to thee, O Israel. Emmanuel means God with us. Even before the coming of Christ, we see passages in the Old Testament that remind us that God was with Israel. In 1 Kings 8, we read, Praise the Lord who has given rest to his people Israel, just as he promised. Not one word has failed of all the wonderful promises he gave through his servant Moses. May the Lord our God be with us as he was with our ancestors. May he never leave us or abandon us. In Psalm 46, we read that the Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our stronghold. One of the most visible reminders of God's presence was during the Exodus. God was with the Israelites as a pillar of fire by night and a pillar of smoke by day. His presence was with them in the tabernacle and later in the temple in the Holy of Holies. But the most important aspect of Emmanuel is found in the New Testament. John tells us in his gospel, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. This is the miracle of the incarnation. God put on human flesh and came to Israel so that he might give his life for all of us. Paul writes to Timothy, Here is the great mystery of our religion. Christ came as a human. This is what we celebrate at Christmas. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Talking about the book today, Choosing Donald Trump. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Let's, if we can, for just a minute, talk about Donald Trump and the Bible, because that's kind of intriguing. You know, before the New York State primary, you had a radio talk show host that asked him what his favorite Bible verse is, and we kind of know he didn't really give us a good answer there. Could not name a favorite verse later on, even which portion of the Bible, the Old or New Testament, that he preferred. This is a man who at one point said, no one reads the Bible more than I do, but he couldn't give that answer, and certainly wasn't really a churchgoer. I know in the Iowa caucus, he was in a church, and at one point he confused a communion plate with an offering plate, almost put money on top of the cups of wine. So this is not the person you would have expected that the so-called Christian right would have rallied behind.
No, you certainly wouldn't have. And I think, again, it's a combination of things. First of all, in the primaries, most of Donald Trump's opponents really imploded. Some of them are my friends. They admit it now. Their campaigns went badly. They got knocked off balance by the Trump juggernaut. And by the time we got to the primaries, Trump was the front runner. I think people voted for him. The religious conservatives voted for him because they thought he could win, number one. Again, they were traumatized by the Obama years, terrified of the possibility of a Hillary Clinton presidency. And they frankly weren't fooled. They didn't think that he was Jesus, Donald Trump, but they did think that he could win and that he shared their values. So they were willing to go with, as one person said, you know, the pagan New York real estate magnate who shared their values. That was really how a lot of people did it. To put it humorously, they held their nose when they voted. But I think that you're right. People knew he was clumsy. People knew he bragged. People knew he was often in a troubled relationship with the truth. But he shared their values, and having had 8 years of a man who didn't, the surveys indicate that they were willing to take the risk, and that's what they did. Now, of course, there's a certain amount of buyer's remorse we can talk about that's happening right now, but back during the election, there's no question that religious conservatives were desperate and looking for someone who would champion their values, even if they didn't necessarily live out those values.
And I might just mention your book is really broken down in different parts, and I thought we might focus for a few minutes on part 2, which is the backstory, because, as you point out, even if he had not become president, he still would have been a very remarkable individual. You have a chapter called King, and it reminds us a little bit of his background, his father and the rest, and even though he's the president, I would imagine that most listeners probably still don't know a lot of, if you will, the backstory of Donald Trump.
No, they don't. They know the headlines, they know the marriages, they know the the drama and the pageants and the TV shows, but they don't know his background. But the fact is that Donald Trump was, in fact, raised in church. His family, the Trump family, were devoted Presbyterians. They attended a Manhattan Presbyterian church, and then they began going to Marble Collegiate Church, very famous church, pastored by Norman Vincent Peale.
Yes.
This is really when you begin to hit I think the religious roots of Donald Trump. Norman Vincent Peale said himself, and I have this, of course, in the book, that he believed in the born-again version of Christianity. But publicly and internationally, he was known mainly for his motivational teaching and motivational speeches and his motivational philosophy. He wrote the famous book, The Power of Positive Thinking, and much of what you hear from Donald Trump comes from these pages, that attitudes are more important than facts, that you can change your reality with your words and your attitudes, and things of that nature. I think the best way to understand Donald Trump is that he was churched, but he was churched under the leadership of a man who had two streams coming out of his life. One, the quieter one, the born-again variety, and the other, more the motivational stream, more the what we're used to today with Tony Robbins and others of that stripe. And so Donald Trump, I think, drank more deeply from the motivational stream. And so, yes, he's in church, but yes, he's basically becoming, getting the footnotes for a kind of killer, winner-take-all kind of philosophy of business. And that's what we see really dominates his life.
Let's talk about that because, again, one of the chapters is king, the other is killer. And he really says, that if somebody crosses you, come back at them 15 times. I'm going to leave out some of the words he uses and go for the jugular, attack them in spades. So, again, there's a ruthlessness to, obviously, that. You can see that in his book, The Art of the Deal, and other places in his life. But that's another part of the personality of Donald Trump, isn't it?
It certainly is. In fact, one of the funniest moments that I chronicle in the book is where Donald Trump is giving one of the convocation speeches at Liberty University. Now, Liberty University, of course, founded by Jerry Falwell, one of the largest Christian undergraduate schools in the world, Protestant certainly. And while he's saying that he's going to champion religious liberty and he needs to end the war on Christmas and they all need to thank the Lord for his gifts in their lives, he then goes on and gives a list of principles that will help all the students lead to success, tens of thousands of them watching. And he says, stick it to your enemies. He's not even aware, I think, that the school's founded on the mission and personality, nature, and character of Jesus, and Jesus taught exactly the opposite, to stick it to your enemies. So all of this to say that this is the conundrum of Donald Trump. I mean, we all know that he's a bundle of conflicted ideas. And there it was in one speech. Let's thank God and let's live for him. And isn't it great we have this university? And then go home and he used stronger language, as you say, stick it to your enemies. And that's just the guy we're dealing with. And he's been that way almost his entire 70 years.
Well, and again, I think it also explains why he's not going to give up Twitter because, again, he will hit up. And a lot of people like that when he goes after CNN or MSNBC or, but he also hits down, and that is he'll go after some people that you go, why did you do that? Just leave that poor innocent person alone. So that's just part of the way it is. You cross him, there's going to be a price to pay. And the fact that he said it during a convocation at Liberty University really tells you all you need to know as to whether or not he's going to give up using Twitter. You did mention Peale. We, of course, have a chapter there as well, but that is, I think, really, again, one of those things that I believe most people have missed. Your book is unique in both the chapter on Norman Vincent Peale and Paula White, because those are two individuals that had a very significant influence in his life. And until you read those chapters, it's a little harder to make sense of who Donald Trump really is, isn't it?
It is. And, we have a problem in our society, especially with the press, they tend to see religion as kind of a wart on a person's nose, an oddity in their life, not really as a serious motivation. The more religious you are, the more cynically they view you. They doubt that you're sincere. Well, Donald Trump is sincere about religion as he understands it, about Christianity as he understands it. And there's just no question that Norman Vincent Peale is a profound influence upon him. The question is, and I'm not accusing Mr. Peale by saying this, the question is which Norman Vincent Peale? Is it the born-again message? Is it the be transformed into Jesus, live for him, surrender your life message, which definitely was in Norman Vincent Peale's preaching at times? Or is it in the you can win, you can shape your reality, almost a karma kind of teaching, your words, your thoughts put out into the universe, come back to you, that kind of thing? I think that Donald Trump definitely maintains the latter. And I think if he is indeed born again, as some people claim, and if he is indeed leaning more towards the evangelical version of Christianity, I'll just say that for clarity, I am an evangelical. The bottom line is that that's fairly recent, probably due to Paula White's influence. So he's a difficult person to understand. You're exactly right.
Let's take some phone calls along the way. We'll go out to California first, KYCC. Victor, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yeah. Again, I was just listening, and heretofore I never realized that Paula White was at all involved in supporting Donald Trump. And at one time, I guess thought the world of Paula White. And I understand that she is a prophet, and yet I can't understand why she, being a woman of God, would support a person who, by all accounts, has been proven to be an assaulter of women, and yet she would support him. Also, I think about all these allegations that people are making against these men who allegedly have assaulted them. While I don't agree with disrespecting or assaulting women whatsoever, I find it very unusual or strange that all of these allegations are coming out, and yet more than likely a number of these very women voted for Donald Trump as to be president, even after knowing full well what had been alleged and even proven that Donald Trump was. I just find that really, I mean, it's unexplainable.
Well, I think I've got the question, and we need to take one of those mandatory breaks. So when we come back, Stephen, the woman vote question is the broader issue, but the specific one about Paula White is one that I know you need to address as well. So that is one of the topics we'll get to in the second half hour here of the interview. If you've just joined us, we're talking with Stephen Mansfield. The book is entitled Choosing Donald Trump: God, Anger, Hope, and Why Christian Conservatives Supported Him. You will no doubt be able to find this book in your local bookstore. We also have information about him, a link to his website, and other resources that you can get as well. We'll be back right after this.
Today, you can make a difference, but you have to act. Recently, Kerby sat down with a couple in California, Stan and Jennifer. Jennifer said, like many Christians, they were concerned about the direction of the culture, but simply hoped something would change. On one of her regular walks through the neighborhood, listening to the radio, she happened to cross Point of View, and before long, she was convinced wishing things would change was not enough. She began taking what she was learning and applying it and sharing it. She even went to the state capitol in Sacramento to stand up for what she believes. You would be surprised how much difference one Jennifer can make, and how many Jennifers you can inspire by giving to Point of View. Your gift today will shape hearts and minds across the nation, helping to shape our future. And thanks to a surprise donor challenge, your gift will be doubled up to at least $45,000. Give today at pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. Answer the challenge. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Stephen Mansfield. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Talking about the book, Choosing Donald Trump. It is out. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we also have a link to his website, and I'll mention it in just a minute. But, Stephen, for people that have just joined us, we had Victor call in just a few minutes ago and say, how is it that Paula White could support Donald Trump? But I can even broaden it. Why is it that so many women, when they heard some of these allegations or some of these stories about Donald Trump, still voted for him as well? That's something, of course, you've had to address there in your book as well.
Sure. I think there are two answers to the question. One is that, interestingly enough, in this plague of sexual abuse allegations that we have of late, surveys show that women are the ones who tend to doubt other women the most. Isn't that interesting?
Yes.
It's just reality. I guess it's human nature. I'm probably more likely to be suspicious of you as a male if you make some claim than a woman would be. I mean, that's just how it goes. But so on the one hand, that's a normal dynamic. On the other hand, I need to say that, in fairness, that Paula White is sensitive to the sexual abuse issue. She was sexually abused as a child, as she has famously said. I don't know that she would have given Donald Trump a pass if she believed that he was guilty. I think the short answer is that she doesn't believe the allegations. And that's, we have that on all of these issues. There are certain people around prominent figures who have come under suspicion or have had allegations against them who just don't believe them. And she said publicly that she does not believe them. So it's not as though she believes he's an abuser and is supporting him anyway. Rightly or wrongly, she doesn't believe that he is an abuser, and therefore has a clear conscience about supporting him. I think that's the best answer for Victor.
I might just mention, too, that you can also go to our website. We have a link to StephenMansfield.tv, and we have information about him, and certainly you can follow that as well. And I mentioned that the book is broken down into different parts. Part 1 is an unlikely champion. Part 2, the backstory. I thought Part 3 we might get to for just a few minutes before we take another phone call, and that's what you call the appeal. Now, the first one I can dispense with pretty quickly, and that is the Johnson Amendment. He learned early on about this amendment. We've talked about this on the program many times before. The goal really was simply to, in 1954, have then Senator Lyndon Johnson running for re-election to prevent some of these groups in particular that were sort of anti-communist groups from criticizing him. So he introduced, without even anything more than a floor vote, there was no hearings or anything like this, a limitation for any 501c3 organization. Now, it doesn't look like he was trying to prevent churches from addressing these issues or anything else. But early on, Donald Trump picked up on the fact that pastors were upset that we still have in the IRS code this so-called Johnson Amendment, which prevented pastors from addressing issues and always running against the fear of losing their tax-exempt status. And he learned that early on and used that in a very effective way to appeal to those people concerned about religious liberty issues.
Well, yeah, exactly. He not only did this sort of sound the right tone for his potential religious supporters, but also he would talk to pastors who were strong supporters of him, and he would say, why can't you just get in your pulpit and say, I support Donald Trump, and all of you should too? In other words, he saw these pastors as representing thousands and thousands of potential supporters, and when they said why they couldn't, of course, the reason was the Johnson Amendment. So I'm not in any way accusing him of being duplicitous, but I think on the one hand he sees it as an injustice, and on the other hand he saw it as a political barrier, that there were potentially tens of thousands, who knows, maybe hundreds of thousands, of people who couldn't hear their pastor say, this is who I'm supporting, and you should too. And so he went after it, and he's still talking about it.
Well, and again, one of the other chapters you have is Obama, President Obama. And so, again, some of that had to do with issues of religious liberty and even speaking at the National Prayer Breakfast and a number of other things. But it does seem to me that, again, we talked about the confluence of all these different issues, but after 8 years of President Barack Obama, the IRS issues that affected 501c3 organizations, 501c4 organizations, and a variety of other issues, that also caused a lot of individuals who, on the one hand, probably did not necessarily like the lifestyle of Donald Trump, nevertheless liked what he was going to do to counteract some of the things that had been part and parcel of their experience over the previous 8 years.
Exactly. And as you say, Kerby, you know, it's these are things that people like Huckabee and Rubio and others, certainly Jeb Bush, had talked about many, many times. I think it sounded fresh coming from the mouth of Donald Trump. I think it had an appeal coming out of his mouth, this man who wasn't known for any kind of religious life, but sort of said, hey, look what I found out. Man, we got to stop this. Let's do it. And had kind of a businessman's approach to the Johnson Amendment or the war on Christmas or whatever he was talking about. That was somehow refreshing. I mean, Rubio's talked about these things for years. Mike Huckabee, goodness, talked about them for decades. But somehow it just had a fresh appeal. And when you combine it with his economic empowerment message and his history of business success, I think, again, it just had an appeal that some people couldn't resist.
Wow. Well, again, one of the things you say early on in the book is sometimes when we vote, you hold your nose for one individual and hold your nose even tighter for another. And even yesterday, we had a person call in and say, this last election, it was just so difficult to vote for either candidate. But here's the interesting irony that you point out in Chapter 9. If you wanted to talk about a religious candidate, it was Hillary Clinton. Now, I'm not an evangelical, but nevertheless, she used a fair amount of religious language. You've got some interviews where she basically goes through and gives Bob Woodward basically kind of, you know, almost a catechism, biblical kind of answers to some of the basic theological issues. So here you have the situation which Donald Trump isn't exactly the church-going individual and is kind of learning the language from Paula White, running against an individual that was using religious language quite frequently, and yet we see the circumstances as they play out. But share a little bit more about that, because obviously on many issues we would, around this table, disagree with Hillary Clinton, but she still was using sort of religious language even in her campaign, wasn't she? She certainly was, and people are surprised when I say this, but the fact is that Hillary Clinton is one of the most outspokenly religious politicians of our generation. There's just no question about it. You look at her Senate speeches, you look at her faith life and public faith life during her First Lady years, you look at her pronouncements, there's just no question that she knows her faith, believes in her faith, is shaped by her faith, and is outspoken about her faith. And it's been thought nothing, by the way, when she was on the Senate, taking the heads off of Republicans she opposed by quoting the words of Jesus and so on. I mean, this is pretty strident stuff. Now, I need to say she ran perhaps one of the worst campaigns from a religious perspective I've ever seen. It was atrocious. My friends, for example, at Christianity Today said they never got their phone calls answered by her campaign. She didn't appoint faith directors until late in the game. She didn't put people in the field at the right time. The symbolism was horrible. My point is that, yes, on the one hand,
if we're just looking at a presidential election as a contest between who's more fluent about religion of whatever kind, Hillary Clinton should have won. But two things happened. She imploded religiously in her campaign, if not in the campaign in general, as we're learning these days. But also Donald Trump was getting tutored rapidly, and he was mastering not just the language, but I think he genuinely shared some of the values that religious leaders were talking about. And so he took the upper hand. And it was a dramatic moment. You would have expected more skill from someone experienced like Hillary Clinton and someone as religiously fluent as she is. But her campaign, we all know now in the postmortem, just completely imploded in general, I think, but certainly on religious issues.
And again, the way the religious right or those religious leaders have still had an impact, my first article here about how evangelicals push for Donald Trump's decision on Jerusalem. That comes from Reuters. There's a couple of other articles we've posted as well. And so even to this day, with this evangelical group that gets together with him, and these are many of the individuals we've interviewed on this program over the years, one of the reasons that we saw the announcement last week about moving the capital, or I should say the embassy to the capital from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Of course, every president has said they're going to do it, and he hasn't yet done it, but it looks much more likely he will do so, is due in part to the religious leaders as well. But we need to take a break, and when we come back, we'll take some of your phone calls. I see a number of calls that we'll try to get to, but we also want to talk about the art of prophetic distance. In the past, you've had people like Billy Graham, who was a counselor to everybody from Harry Truman to John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan. But again, what about the need for some kind of distance for those individuals who are religious leaders? And that's another very important part. It's actually the fourth section of this book, which again is written by Stephen Mansfield, Choosing Donald Trump, and it's called Of Prophets and Presidents. So we'll take a minute to talk about that as well, and then also take some of your phone calls. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. The book is just coming out, and it's a great opportunity for you to hear from Stephen Mansfield, but also for you to read it as well. Would encourage you to find it in your local bookstore, but we also have some links so you can get it online as well. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation with him and take some of your phone calls right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Most residents of Lehigh County, Pennsylvania probably have no idea what their county seal looks like. It has a cow, factories, a silo, an oil lamp set on two books, a courthouse, flags and bunting, and more. Recently, a federal district court reluctantly declared the seal unconstitutional because, centered in the background of it all, is a cross. According to the court's opinion, quote, the county has not legally compelled its citizens to practice and conform to Christianity, infringed on freedom of conscience, or created political conflict between the Christian church and other religious sects. Simply put, the county of Lehigh did not intend to establish religion or institute a county religion, unquote. And so the court concluded, quote, Lehigh County's seal is a passive symbol that does not coerce any citizen to practice or adhere to Christianity and does not establish a county religion. Thus, the seal does not violate the plain text of the Establishment Clause, nor does it establish a religion in the way the drafters of the First Amendment imagined. Higher courts, however, have delineated a different mechanism by which the court must determine whether the seal survives constitutional scrutiny. While the court may not fully agree with the test provided, the court must apply that test, unquote. Well, we can only hope an appeal will change that test. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Students and teachers are being told that prayer, Bibles, and religion are illegal in public school, but that's not true. Learn the facts. Read your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org right now. Don't let anyone steal your freedom with bad information. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Stephen Mansfield with us for a few more minutes, and just before I take some more phone calls, I want to come back to the book, Choosing Donald Trump. And you have a section here on the art of prophetic distance, and maybe the best way to illustrate that is to go back to Billy Graham going and meeting with Harry Truman, and then coming out of the Oval Office, and the reporters ask, well, what did you do? We prayed. Well, can you show us? And he kneels down on the ground, and of course that was a source of incredible embarrassment. And I think he learned a lesson the hard way, and that is, if you're going to be a prophet, sometimes you have to speak truth to power. And of course, I think Billy Graham learned that as well with Richard Nixon. But that's one of the issues that you've got here as well. If you have these conservative Christian leaders around Donald Trump, they need to keep some distance, don't they?
They do. We need to always remember when we're involved in politics that we are representatives of another kingdom, not a Republican kingdom or a Democrat kingdom, but the kingdom of God. And so we want to call our elected leaders to their best. We want to hold up a moral and a godly grid for them. We want to pastor them if they're open to that, help them in any way we can spiritually. But we don't need to become part of their PR team. We don't need to, as the crass phrase is today, get in bed with them. And I think that's what a lot of religious leaders did. They began to rebrand Donald Trump. They began to talk about him as Jesus, Churchill, Lincoln, Darius the Great. We heard all kinds of things. But I think there is an art, and certainly Billy Graham came to this at the end of his life, that, there's a way that we call people to their best, hold up the will of God before their face as they're in positions of power, but we don't have to, again, try to sell them or try to join their PR efforts. We need to always be emissaries of another kingdom. I think had we done this a little bit more in this election, Donald Trump might not, feel like he's, in a sense, got us in his hands, under his arm, but instead would be aspiring to rise to the expectations and the hopes that we have and the demands we're placing upon him.
Well, let's take some phone calls, and we'll go to Missouri first. KTTK. Debbie, thank you for joining us today. You're on with Stephen Mansfield.
Hello, Stephen. Hello to everyone. Merry Christmas. Okay,
thank you very much.
You're welcome. Number one, I truly believe that God put Donald Trump as our president. I think that for a lot of reasons. One, more evangelicals voted this year than probably ever. Number two, there was a book written, and I can't remember the author, but it has a lot of different preachers that have said this, that, and the other, along with other people. And there was a bishop who, at some point back in, and I believe it was the late 80s, early 90s, said that Donald Trump was going to be our president. And the other preacher that went to see him said, "Why do you say that?" And he said, "Because God's going to do it." I mean, he may not have used those exact words, but that's what he said. Okay, and this thing about all these people, I was molested, I was touched, I was whatever. Okay, I'm a firm believer only because I've seen it. And Drain the Swamp, in my opinion, was some of the nicest words ever spoken in government.
Drain the Swamp, yeah. And and the women issue, again, as Debbie points out, there is a little bit of skepticism. Even today, we started out the story with Tavis Smiley, who's saying, wait a minute, this did not happen. Now, we'll see whether or not it isn't. But I think we're going to see somewhere soon, Stephen, kind of a pushback. And some people say, maybe we've gone too far, that any allegation is made and you can't really exonerate yourself in the court of public opinion. What's your thoughts?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I think every institution is going to have to have a procedure for verifying these things. One of the phrases that concerns me in our modern culture is so and so. There were allegations against him, therefore he was removed. There were allegations against so and so, therefore he was dismissed. Well, I don't mean to make light of this at all. I'm obviously stridently opposed to sexual abuse in any form. But if we don't have good procedures, allegations alone aren't facts. Allegations alone shouldn't remove anybody. Every organization needs to have a procedure for verifying these things. And so, yeah, I think we're going to have a little bit of pushback, and the best answer for that is to have solid procedures for verifying facts. And then absolutely, abusers should be dismissed and removed and, shamed publicly. That's how it's going to happen. But I'm a little concerned about the lightness with which allegations can be made and then acted on. Please don't misunderstand. It's not that I'm not taking the allegations seriously. It's just that they shouldn't be acted on until they're drilled down and the facts are verified.
Let's take another phone call. We'll go to Kentucky, WYGE. Kim, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Well, I have a comment on the fact that, I heard you all saying something about Hillary Clinton answering the questions religiously and biblically. And, Satan knows the Bible. And
she did. It's interesting. She did give right answers. I mean, and I had not seen that till I read the book, because, most of the things that Hillary Clinton said are not covered by the secular press because they don't even understand the religious significance of some of it. But it was kind of intriguing to see that. But go ahead.
And, Satan gives the right answers. And also, just because you say you're religious does not mean that you're a child of Christ. My niece is very religious. She's a witch. Mm-hmm. So those were my comments, and I just want to put my 2 cents worth in.
Appreciate that. Again, Hillary Clinton used a lot of religious language in a lot of different speeches, but you wouldn't know it, Stephen, unless you read your book sometimes, because the secular press, reporters, it just sort of flies over their head. Sometimes even the allusions and phrases, they don't know even where those come from. And so in some respects, by reading your book, I realized she was using a fair amount of religious language, even if it didn't get reported in the New York Times every day.
Well, no, again, the secular journalists are a little embarrassed by religion, even if it comes from somebody on the left. I think the caller makes a good point. I choose my words very carefully. When I speak of Hillary Clinton, I speak of a broader religion. I don't know exactly where she is with Jesus. I don't know exactly where she is as a Christian. But she's definitely on the left side of the spectrum politically. So, when I say religion, I mean exactly that. And there's no question. To put it, as she said almost humorously, the devil can master the language, master our language, master Christian language. So we need to be very, very careful. But the fact is that sincere religion is very much behind what many people are doing up on the Hill today in D.C., where I live, by the way. But there are also people who master that language and use it for show. We've got to be discerning and be able to distinguish between those who are sincere and those who are essentially engaged in window dressing.
Let me just mention, before we run out of time, that we have a link to your website, StephenMansfield.tv. You don't have to spell it all out. We have it there. And, of course, this book, Choosing Donald Trump. Of course, we've talked in the past about the Mansfield's Book of Manly Men, and we've talked about a variety of stories. We, of course, talked about the miracle of the Kurds. We've talked about Lincoln's battle with God, the faith of George W. Bush, Winston Churchill, and a number. And so if those books are not easily found in your bookstore, you can go to your website and find out a little bit more about you. So we want to make sure that people visit your website, find those links, and read some of the great books that you've written over the years.
Well, thank you very much. I'd love to hear from your supporters and callers, and I think we're talking about extremely important things in our current culture.
Well, again, I appreciate the writing you've done over the years. I've learned a lot about Lincoln. I've certainly learned a lot about Barack Obama and George W. Bush, and I'm learning a lot in reading this book about Donald Trump. So thanks again for joining us here on Point of View.
Very kind, Kerby. Look forward to being with you next time. Merry Christmas.
Looking forward to the next one. Merry Christmas. I apologize. We have more callers than we have time, but you know what? We have our Friday weekend edition tomorrow. Kelly Shackelford will be with us, and we have Jerry Tuma with us, and so this will be interesting because we'll get into some of the economic issues as well, and I've always wondered about bitcoins and wondered about stocks and some other things. We'll get into that as well. Of course, we'll talk about some of the religious liberty issues with Kelly Shackelford, so if you didn't get through today, you can get through tomorrow, and we'll have our roundtable discussion. If you'd like to know more about our two guests, Robby Gallaty, the first hour, Stephen Mansfield, the second hour, those are available on the website, pointofview.net. Posted a couple of other articles that you might want to read, and it's all available on our website, pointofview.net. As we end today, let me just mention we still have our $45,000 match for 45 years of ministry, so your gift will be doubled. Please give us your gift, and we'll see you back here tomorrow.
Today, you can make a difference, but you have to act. Recently, Kerby sat down with a couple in California, Stan and Jennifer. Jennifer said, like many Christians, they were concerned about the direction of the culture, but simply hoped something would change. On one of her regular walks through the neighborhood, listening to the radio, she happened to cross Point of View, and before long, she was convinced wishing things would change was not enough. She began taking what she was learning and applying it and sharing it. She even went to the state capitol in Sacramento to stand up for what she believes. You would be surprised how much difference one Jennifer can make, and how many Jennifers you can inspire by giving to Point of View. Your gift today will shape hearts and minds across the nation, helping to shape our future. And thanks to a surprise donor challenge, your gift will be doubled up to at least $45,000. Give today at pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. Answer the challenge. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.